Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is Gamera the Giant Monster. Now, Gamera the Giant Monster is a Japanese giant monster film, or Kaiju film, released in 1965. Now, a heavily re-edited English version of this film titled Gamera the Invincible was released in 1966 in the US. Now, I'll talk more about the American version of this film later on in this video. Now, the film was directed by Noriaki Yuasa, whose name I'm probably butchering, and it was written by Niisan Takahashi, whose name I'm definitely butchering, and it was produced and distributed by Japanese film studio Daiei, who would later do the Daimajin trilogy. Now, the original genesis for this movie was actually much different than the movie we ended up getting. This movie actually came about because of an unfinished kaiju film called Giant Horde Beast Nesula, which was a film attempting to capitalize on the success of Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds and Toho's Godzilla series. Basically, it was going to be about giant rats attacking Tokyo. The issue is the filmmakers decided to use real rats attacking miniature sets, which would have been great if it wasn't for the fact that the rats were incredibly unruly and they ended up multiplying, and they also had fleas and other parasites, so the health department shut the production down. Now, while this movie never got made, it did inspire the 2002 horror film Nesula the Rat Monster, as well as a biopic on the making of this failed production called Nesula 1964, released in 2020. Now, the president of Daiei at the time, whose name I'm probably going to mispronounce like the other names I've mentioned, he was determined to do a kaiju film because Daiei was sort of a rival studio to Toho, and Daiei really wanted to have their own giant monster to sort of compete with Godzilla. Now, rumor has it that while he was on a plane, he saw a turtle-shaped cloud, which gave him the idea for a movie about a giant flying turtle. However, this story has kind of fallen under some scrutiny. Like, I believe there were plans to do an anthology film prior to this that had a segment about a giant turtle. So ultimately we got Gamera the Giant Monster, which is in essence a ripoff of Godzilla, but it's not without its merits, and the movie also seems to owe a lot to the British giant monster film Gorgo. Now, the plot of Gamera the Giant Monster is it begins where an unidentified aircraft is shot down by US forces over the Arctic. It turns out that this aircraft was carrying an atomic bomb, and the explosion releases a giant prehistoric turtle dubbed Gamera that has been laying dormant under the ice for millions of years. Now this giant turtle attacks Japan, but threatens the world at large. So, the movie follows a scientist, his daughter, and a journalist as they try to help the JSDF in stopping this creature. Meanwhile, a turtle-obsessed little boy named Toshio, who is convinced that Gamera is his friend, is trying to stop them from hurting Gamera, and it seems like the only thing that might be able to stop this creature is something called Plan Z. Now, plot-wise, Gamera the Giant Monster does mirror the original Godzilla in a lot of ways. Both movies are about prehistoric monsters being brought back to life by nuclear radiation, and both movies ultimately culminate in the monster being defeated by some new weapon or some secret plan. In the film, you also have the character of Dr. Hidaka, who's a very similar character to Professor Yamane from the original Godzilla. I would say the big difference is the tone and the intent of both movies. The original Godzilla from Ishiro Honda was actually meant to make a political statement about the usage of atomic weapons and about the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where Godzilla was very much a metaphor for all that. And the original Godzilla was really more of a dark drama film that just happened to feature a giant monster as the main antagonist. Gamera, despite being filmed in stark black and white, is a much more lighthearted and goofier film, and is a film that's much more intended for children. Now, granted, the Godzilla series at this point was already starting to get geared more towards children to begin with, but I actually think the much more lighthearted tone of this movie actually influenced the Godzilla series going forward. Now, Gamera the Giant Monster, I respect the legacy that this movie left behind, and I do respect this original film, but I honestly find the first Gamera movie to be just okay. One of my issues with this movie is it seems like it doesn't really know what it wants to be. Like, there's a lot of aspects of this movie where it's clear that they intended this for children, especially what Plan Z ends up being. It's really kind of silly. But then the film tries to have a political message, but it doesn't really work that well in the film. Like, it feels much more superficial compared to the political messages that you saw in Ashiro Honda's giant monster films. But there is a message in the film about what can happen when mankind works together, because Plan Z really only works when Japan, the United States, and Russia all work together. So it's a film that tries to be a serious monster movie, but it's also very campy as well. Another issue I have with the film is the human characters, while they're certainly not unlikable, they're definitely forgettable. Now, the character of Toshio, for as much of an annoying little shit as this character is, he's probably the most memorable human character in the film, and I will say it was actually kind of unique for the time to have that scene where Gamera saves Toshio to kind of suggest that even though Gamera is the villain of the film, it does imply that there is some benevolence in this creature. Like, Toshio, when I said that the human characters aren't unlikable, I kind of have to take that back, because Toshio is a very, very unlikable character. Like, he outright almost gets himself killed several times in the movie, and actually almost gets other people killed who are trying to save him from getting himself killed. What Gamera the Giant Monster does have going for it, though, is actually the monster itself, Gamera. Gamera is actually a very unique kaiju. Now, in the past, I've called Gamera the poor man's Godzilla, and the more that I think about it, I think I was being kind of unfair, because as much as I'm not a fan of these earlier Gamera films, I can't deny that Gamera is an original monster. And as silly as it is, the idea of a giant flying turtle that can fly around by shooting fire out of its body that allows it to spin around like a flying saucer, that is a very original and unique idea. And I honestly think it's the uniqueness of Gamera that's the reason the film caught on the way that it did. And while it is a very standard kaiju film in a lot of regards, at least in terms of the plot and characters, the movie definitely makes up for that in the special effects department, which are actually pretty good for the time. Sure, they're dated and cheesy by today's standards, but for the time I think they work very well. Especially the scene where Gamera is attacking Tokyo. So, Gamera the Giant Monster, while I respect the legacy that this film left behind, overall this is definitely not one of my favorite giant monster films at all. Now, this movie was released in America in 1966 under the title Gammera the Invincible, and very similar to what they did with the original Godzilla when they brought it over to the States as Godzilla King of the Monsters. Not only was the film dubbed over in English, but the film was also drastically re-edited, and they also added additional scenes of American actors. In this version of the film, they add a whole subplot about the United States military trying to figure out how they're gonna help Japan stop Gamera, and in some of these scenes you actually have Brian Donlevy, who most people might recognize as Bernard Quatermass from Hammer's adaptations of The Quatermass Experiment and Quatermass 2, and maybe it's just me, but in the few scenes that he shows up in, you can kinda tell that he doesn't want to be there.
Gentlemen, Gamera must be stopped. God knows where he'll strike next. So far, the American weapons have been completely ineffective, and the Japanese radar systems offer barely enough warning to evacuate the civilian populations. We must now work as one cohesive unit with one objective, creating a plan to destroy Gamera before he destroys civilization. General Arnold.
Thank you, sir. Both Dr. Hidaka and Dr. Morass are convinced that Gamera is continually on the hunt for food. There is some chemical substance in our fuel that it needs to exist.
Now, with this American version of the film, not only is the dubbing of the original Japanese footage really bad, but in the additional American scenes, it seems like they tried to make it kind of a comedy, especially in scenes like this.
If you'll get down from your pulpit for 1 minute, I'd like to ask you why Washington is so silent about all this. Or do you know more about it than the government?
It would not be the first time Washington has kept the truth from the public, whether it be flying saucers or Gamera.
Oh, so now you believe in flying saucers, along with 200-feet turtles that survive atomic bomb explosions. Of course, we all know there really is a Santa Claus. Oh, Dr. Contraire, every time you bray, you make a bigger jackass of yourself.
Jules, please. We're on the air.
Mr. Standish, I demand an apology. I've devoted my life to science.
Gentlemen.
You'll get no apology from me, Contraire. I prefer to
You have no scholarships to back your arguments. You have no arguments, only invective. Read Virgil's Laocoon. Read Paradise Lost.
The ravings of a lunatic.
Read of the Pyrites, the fire without and the frost within. Read, you ignorant ape. Read what intelligent men have written for thousands of years.
What did he call me?
Jules, please.
He called me an ape?
No,
Gentlemen.
not merely ape.
Quiet. Please
Ignorant
remember that we're
ape.
on the...
Why, you?
Remember that we're
Call
on
me.
the
How dare
air.
you
Will you
call me
gentlemen?
an ape? Where'd you get your diploma? Made in
Ladies
Japan?
and gentlemen,
Oh, you're going to give me
I hear
What do you want,
about
advance man?
I hope you'll be with us
Something
again
for the
next
circus or
week for
something?
another
What do you expect to
discussion.
make out of this? I'd like to
tell
see
you
who
the
you
guest will be.
Now, one thing about the American version that I almost forgot to mention, in the American scenes there is a Japanese character, and oh my god, I don't know if this is how the actor actually spoke or not, or they actually tell him to speak this way, but if they actually told this actor to speak this way, it's borderline racist how this one particular Japanese character talks in the movie. Like, it's some of the most stereotypical English I've ever heard in my life.
We are certain that Gamera will remain at the Kyushu refinery as long as we are able to feed him. However, our fuel supply is now dangerously low. Without an airlift, we cannot keep him there.
We've anticipated this, sir.
Now, I'm not going to go on a huge rant about how this version is a complete bastardization of the original Japanese version, because, again, I'm not really the biggest fan of the original Gamera film to begin with. But I guess if you're gonna watch the original Gamera, watch the original Japanese version. Now, this American version of the film actually fell into the public domain, and I actually have the film on several of these public domain box sets, like this one called Sci-Fi Classics, which actually has Gamera right on the cover there. And because this version of the film is public domain, you could also watch it for free on YouTube. Now, there was another English dub of this movie, simply titled Gamera, released by Sandy Frank in the 80s, and this version of the film is a little closer to the original Japanese version. However, in the dub-in, they refer to Toshio as Kenny, which actually led to sort of a joke among kaiju fans. Whenever there's an annoying kid character in a kaiju film, they call this kid Kenny. But this is the version of the film that was later riffed on Mystery Science Theater 3000. Now, Gamera the Giant Monster ended up spawning a franchise. Now, while it never became quite as big as the Godzilla series, Gamera in his own right has become a very iconic character. Now, the movie spawned 7 initial sequels, which, together with the first movie, make up what's now known as the Showa Gamera series, because they came out when Japan was in its Showa period. The final film of the Showa Gamera series was 1980's Gamera Super Monster. The series was rebooted in 1995 with Gamera Guardian of the Universe by Shusuke Kaneko, which he followed up with 2 sequels, Gamera 2 Attack of Legion and Gamera 3 Revenge of Iris, making up what's known as the Heisei Gamera trilogy, which are easily the best films in the entire Gamera franchise, and that's the main reason I really wanted to review the Gamera films, was so I could eventually get to the 90s Gamera series, which really is when the franchise actually gets really, really good. Especially the third one, Gamera 3 Revenge of Iris is not just considered to be the best film in the Gamera franchise, it's also ranked alongside the original Godzilla as one of the best kaiju films ever made. The series was rebooted again in 2006 with Gamera the Brave, and for years there have been talks of another Gamera film, but for some reason it never came to fruition. I know back in 2015 there actually was a trailer made for a new Gamera film, but I guess that was just a fan-made trailer or something. Gamera has also appeared in comic books and video games, and he even showed up on an episode of Justice League Unlimited. Granted, they didn't actually call him Gamera in that episode, but it was so clearly Gamera. So yeah, that was my review on Gamera the Giant Monster, and I will be reviewing the sequels to this film very soon.